Every Spartan program in Halo comes back to the same cold math: how many people one super soldier is worth. In 2517, 6-year-old children vanished from their beds, and only 33 of 75 came out the other side as weapons. Across 6 decades of augmentation, someone always paid the difference. Today I'm breaking down all 4 Spartan generations, and what each one figured out about cutting that price, starting with the version that got cancelled before it even had a name: Orion Project. Every legend needs an origin, and this one starts with a name that got handed out after the funeral. Here's the hot take: Orion spent its operational years as a classified military program and only earned the word Spartan when Dr. Halsey decided the Spartan 2 program needed a cleaner origin story. The timeline alone should stop you cold. Orion traces back to 2031, an activation date that puts it nearly 2 centuries ahead of the Spartan story most people actually know. 200 years of runway sat between that activation and the version of a Spartan the wider galaxy would eventually fear. A stretch of time long enough to swallow entire careers, entire wars, entire generations of soldiers who never lived to see the name attached to what they started. That span had gaps in it too. Dead stretches where the project sat shelved and forgotten. The project went dark and resurfaced at least once, revived formally by the Colonial Military Administration on January 29, 2491, with the Office of Naval Intelligence quietly attached to the paperwork this time around, a detail that reads small now and matters enormously later. 15 years after that relaunch, the file closed. Orion got shut down in 2506 after the augmentations caused crippling physical and mental side effects. Costs climbed too high, and the results fell short of what all that funding had promised. 3 grim findings filed away in some UNSC ledger between 2 other canceled programs, and together they killed the first generation of augmented humans in UNSC history. The soldiers who actually survived the augmentation process remained in service. They were reassigned to special operations units, their upgraded bodies still useful long after the money behind them dried up, still running classified special operations missions. 7 years later, in 2513, records started calling them Spartan Y, a title stitched onto files written under the Orion name at the time, applied retroactively by people who weren't even in the room when the program existed. Whether that counts as a real Spartan generation is still argued today. And honestly, the case is thin. Almost nothing about the original program was built around the specific identity Spartan would later carry. The label is a retrofit, stapled onto survivors years after the project that made them was already closed, which makes Orion less a founding chapter and more a rough draft. Somebody decided to canonize years after the fact. Strip away the mythology, and what you're left with is a medical failure flattened into an accountant's decision. The augmentations caused crippling side effects, costs climbed too high, and the results fell short of what was promised. The same grim equation that closes any underperforming division, whether it's building super soldiers or just running a regional sales office. That's the whole legend at the start. Side effects and a price tag closed the file, and for 11 years, that was the entire story. Canceling a program after crippling side effects, disappointing results, and runaway costs only works if nobody needs it anymore. 11 years after that file closed, someone found a way to make the raw material cost almost nothing, because the raw material was already alive, already breathing, and small enough to carry. Dr. Catherine Halsey solved the problem that had killed Orion, adult bodies rejecting augmentation, by finding subjects whose bodies were still malleable enough to accept it. The physiology is the whole story here. Orion got shut down in 2506 because the adult volunteers' bodies rejected the augmentations, producing debilitating physical illness, mental instability, and side effects beyond the UNSC's ability to manage. Halsey's fix, starting in 2517, was to stop recruiting adults entirely and start taking children whose bodies were still developing and could accept the augmentations adults had rejected. 75 kids, all around age 6, got flagged through genetic screening and pulled out of their homes across dozens of worlds, chosen for traits nobody bothered to explain to the people they belonged to. The UNSC skipped the part where it asks their parents. It replaced each child with a flash clone, which would sicken and die soon after due to the complications inherent in flash cloning an entire human being, so a grieving family would bury a body in a small coffin instead of filing a missing persons report. That's the detail that turns this from a recruitment drive into something closer to a crime scene with a training schedule attached. The arithmetic gets worse before it gets better. Of those 75 children, only 33 survived the augmentation procedures that turned them into Spartans. 42 kids went through the same surgeries as John 1:17 and never came out the other side looking anything like the soldiers the program promised. For some, that meant death right there on the table. For others, it meant crippling injury, or a body too damaged to ever wear the armor it was built for in the first place. 33 walked out. 33 became a devastatingly effective anti-insurgency force, dropped onto rebellion after rebellion across the outer colonies in the brief window before the Covenant arrived, cleaning up conflicts the UNSC had struggled to contain. That window was brutally brief. The Human-Covenant War began in early 2525 and became the overwhelming priority almost immediately. By the middle of that decade, they were suited into Mjolnir Mark IV, powered armor that turned an already lethal soldier into something that could shrug off small arms fire and punch clean through a bulkhead like it was drywall. This is the moment a Spartan stops being a really good infantryman and starts being a piece of hardware the UNSC builds an entire war strategy around, which is exactly why the argument never dies. John 1:17 alone is credited with pivotal victories across the war, and it's easy enough to point at a Spartan holding a line no regular unit could hold and call the price worth paying. Nobody who says that is wrong about the results. The results are real. The outer colonies saw insurrectionist movements crushed, and the kill counts back it up in ways no committee could argue with. But the results sit next to a different number, one that never makes it into the briefing. The raw material was a 6-year-old asleep in his own bed, and 42 of them paid the entry fee in full. Survival was the one thing that entry fee never bought them. Both of those facts are true at the same time, sitting right next to each other in the same program, and the franchise has never fully picked a side. 33 survivors made a legend and a bottleneck at the same time, because a weapon this good, built from a resource this scarce and this ethically radioactive, only works as long as the war stays small enough for 33 people to hold it. The UNSC was about to find out what happens when it doesn't. The design goal was written down as a feature, not a flaw, cheap and expendable. That is how the lore consistently describes a program meant to build soldiers. And it belonged to a super soldier initiative that ONI approved and funded in full. 2 generations earlier, the UNSC agonized over spending on 75 candidates, treating that number like a fortune they could barely justify. This program graduated 300 in its first major batch alone, and its classification kept it largely shielded from that kind of scrutiny. Spartan 3 started as a classified ONI Section 3 project, built to work alongside Spartan 2 rather than replace it outright. The math behind it was blunt. A single Spartan 2 took years and a fortune to produce, survived brutal augmentation odds just to make it to the field, and then got treated like a strategic asset too valuable to risk carelessly. Command wanted numbers they could actually deploy into the meat grinder without triggering a small existential crisis every time one went down. So the program flipped the entire premise on its head. Instead of investing everything into a handful of near-invincible soldiers, ONI decided to build soldiers who were built to be lost from day one. Colonel James Ackerson ran the project, and Ackerson approached it the way a man approaches a budget he is genuinely proud of. Picture him at a desk, looking at the Spartan 2 casualty math, and just kind of nodding along to himself. So, you're telling me 1 in 3 didn't survive the process? That's right, sir. Perfect. Now do that, but faster, and with kids. 497 candidates entered training in that first large cohort, sourced quietly and processed through a track designed to move quicker and spend less than the Spartan 2 pipeline ever did. The strategic logic was simple on paper. More bodies in the field, at a lower individual cost, meant Command could throw them at the missions too dangerous or too disposable to risk on the expense of originals. High casualty operations stopped being a last resort and became a core feature of the program's design. That is the part that turns the earlier program's losses into something colder in hindsight. 33 of 75 survived becoming Spartans under Spartan 2, and that number was treated as an acceptable cost of doing business. Spartan 3 looked at that acceptable cost and asked how to get more of it for less money per soldier. Many fans call this the tragedy generation, and the label holds up against the evidence rather than just sounding dramatic for effect. Orion was quietly deactivated in 2506, undercut by severe side effects and thinning funding on a program many in Command had grown skeptical of. Spartan 3 is the version of that same argument that finally won, because it stopped trying to make the perfect soldier and started trying to make an affordable one instead. The program's stated purpose was cost reduction through volume. Its deployment record leaned on high-risk missions built around exactly that volume, and both point toward the same cold conclusion. A strong case can be made that this generation carried more of the war's weight than Spartan 2 ever advertised, and got a fraction of the recognition for it. That is the quiet joke buried in this whole accounting exercise. Orion collapsed under severe side effects and funding that had already dried up. Spartan 3 got greenlit because it figured out how to make death itself the cost-saving measure, line item and all. Spartan 2 and Spartan 3 solved their shortage the same way, by reaching for someone who had no say in the matter. Children asleep in their beds. Candidates pulled into a program built around acceptable losses before they ever understood what the losses were even for. Orion had tried grown volunteers decades earlier. Once, before Command shelved that model in favor of cheaper children for 2 generations running. The fix, when it finally returned, was almost embarrassingly simple. Somebody just had to walk up and ask again. Admiral Margaret Perengoski signed her name on September 20th, 2552, and the paperwork behind that signature is the strangest document in the entire Spartan program. The Covenant War still had weeks left to run. Earlier Spartans were still dying in it, while Perengoski was already deciding what came after them. Read it as replacement speed yielding to a stranger question. Could the next generation choose the job? Her answer changed the basic transaction behind the project. The next generation would be built entirely from people who could hear the risks, study the offer, and say no. One program timeline places the activation on that September date. Other material puts the real rollout in early 2553, a few months later. That gap deserves an honest mention before the larger point swallows it, because either date produces the same transformation. The program changed who could become a Spartan and what their agreement was worth. Spartan 4 recruited from UNSC Special Forces and other seasoned military volunteers. These were adults with service records, people who had already endured combat, command structures, and the extremely glamorous experience of military paperwork. They read a briefing and signed a form. The program entered active duty alongside a new generation of Mjolnir armor in January 2553, and within a few years, it became the primary Spartan force the UNSC fielded. The old process began with 6-year-olds pulled from bunk beds at 0300 and flash clones placed in hospital bassinets, leaving mothers to grieve a corpse while the truth disappeared into a sealed file. This process began with an operator, already trained and already an adult, deciding for herself that the risk was worth taking. Consent sounds almost boring here. That is exactly why it matters. Now put that signature beside the number sitting underneath each earlier program. 75 children were taken in 25 and 17. 8 years later, 33 of them survived augmentation to become what Halsey designed them to be. The other 42 were casualties. Apparently, the spreadsheet needed another pass. Imagine a UNSC ledger pricing a dead volunteer at twice the cost of a dead child. A sentence so ugly that the bureaucracy almost deserves credit for making it possible. Ackerson spent 2531 to 2537 hunting for a version of that same shortcut that hurt less to look at. Spartan 2 carries Halsey's math. Spartan 3 carries Ackerson's. Each built around the belief that surgery saves money when it starts before the subject is old enough to refuse it. The fanbase argues about what Spartan 4 actually is, and the argument matters more than it looks. One side calls it the healthiest Spartan program the UNSC ever ran, the version where childhood stays with the child and adulthood carries the choice. The other side says it's missing something, that adults in armor lack the same weight as a class of kidnapped children turned into myth. That discomfort has a point, although probably a different one than intended. Both sides are circling the same fact from opposite directions. The parity camp argues that a grown Special Forces operator can sign a consent form and emerge, with GN2 armor, as a soldier comparable to anything Halsey built from a stolen 6-year-old. The tragedy was a choice the UNSC kept making because a child can't say no, and a file can be sealed for 30 years. That realization changes the shape of every generation before it. Orion's expense, the 75 children of 2517, the 33 survivors, the 42 left behind, and Ackerson's 6-year search all point toward the same brutally ordinary answer. The UNSC kept treating suffering like a technical ingredient, as though the correct dosage of stolen childhood might finally balance the accounts. Then, seasoned adults walked in, signed their own names, and made the old arithmetic look exactly as monstrous as it was. Nearly 2.5 centuries of trying to make a Spartan cheaper. And the answer sitting at the bottom of the ledger the entire time was one adult, one signature, one yes. Admiral Perengoski's 2552 discovery concerned the price the UNSC had chosen to pay. For over 30 years, the program spent children while somebody willing stood ready to pay in themselves. One adult reads the risks. One hand signs the page. One yes finally exposes what all those sealed files were built to hide. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.